Hey, what's up? It's Jared with Ditch Auto. Today we're here with the Nikon Z6 and I'm going to talk about my 6 months of experience with this camera. Now throughout this video I'm going to be showing you some photos and video that I've shot with it, but I wanted to talk about this camera and my 6 months of experience with it because it's just been something so different and really a great camera that I have really enjoyed using. Now when I first got my hands on this camera, it was just the basic kit with the Z6 and the 24 to 70 millimeter f4 lens. And even though an f4 lens would be, kind of a bummer because I have my Sony cameras with my f2.8 lens, and so I would rather use that. There was no f2.8 at the time for the Nikon Z platform, and so I ended up still using this camera for a couple of reasons. The first is that it just kind of got really compact and it was easy to carry. The ergonomics of the camera were really nice. I enjoyed having a little bit more to hold on to. The camera system felt a little bit more balanced to me. So even with the lighter lens, this is the 2.8, but with the 24-70 f4 on there, it felt really nice and balanced. And that lens has this feature that you can kind of really compact the lens a bit, so it just fits in your bag, and so you're getting that full frame camera experience. You're getting a 24 to 70 zoom, but the lens, when you're carrying the camera, it's just taking up less space. So I definitely would end up going to the camera because of that. Now, this camera also seemed to just be faster to grab and go for me than my other cameras. And this year, I have used a lot of cameras. Not only have I been shooting with Sony for, over 5 years, closer to 6 years now, and then prior to that shooting Canon, but I also had a Canon EOS R that I utilized over the summertime of this year. And I still ended up going to the Nikon Z6 quite often for those few reasons. The ergonomics, the button placement is really great on this camera. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The battery life was relatively good. And even though I was fairly limited on lenses up until recently, it didn't really matter because the camera was just grab and go easier. I fire the camera up, it's easier just to start shooting. I don't really know what it is. If it's the startup time of the camera, which is pretty quick, the buttons and the layout of everything is really easy. And once you just kind of remember where some of the buttons are initially, it just seems easier to use this camera. I also liked the XQD card because the writing speed or the offloading speed of the photos to my computer or my iPad were extremely fast, and so that definitely helped. And just the ports were more easily accessible on this camera. So those things definitely made it a little bit easier for me to use. Plus, I'm a hybrid shooter. I shoot both photo and video, and this camera remembers your settings for each of those modes. There's this little toggle on the back of the camera to switch between photo and video mode instead of having to rotate the dial all the way around. And when you go between those modes, the camera will remember my manual settings for photo, and then when I toggle that switch, it will remember my settings for video. That's something that my Sony cameras don't do. And so when I know that I'm going to go out and I'm going to shoot a couple of photos and I want to shoot a little video clip or two, it's just much easier for me to grab this camera and do that because I'm not going to have to fuss around with settings. And especially a lot of the situations that I find myself in shooting, I don't have time to be going and changing my settings or configuring a custom mode. And then, it's just easier for me to toggle back and forth really quickly, not have to worry about it. It's just much easier on this camera. And so being that I had access to all of those cameras, I had 4 different Sony cameras, 2 full frame, 2 APS-C. I had the Canon EOS R, and I had this camera, and then a couple of compacts. But I always ended up running to this camera because it just felt easier. And naturally, we're going to want to go with what's easier. So now that I've talked about that and just the fact that this camera tends to be one that I just kind of gravitate to for some reason, even though I have a ton more Sony stuff, I have a ton more Sony lenses than I did for this camera. I started out with just the 24-70 f4, and it wasn't until about a month and a half ago that I started getting a few additional lenses for this camera. The 24-70 f2.8 didn't really come out that long ago. Their additional prime lenses didn't really come out that long ago either, and there still isn't a very large lens lineup for this camera. Now, back when I switched to Sony, there wasn't a very large lens lineup for Sony mirrorless either. There was a bunch of f4 lenses, but because the Sony was just so much better of an experience and so much better in low light, I didn't care that all I had was f4 lenses. I got rid of all my Canon stuff and shot with Sony and Sony f4 lenses until their G Master lenses started coming out. And of course, I've invested heavily in G Master lenses. But with this camera, it reminded me of that. It reminded me of when I switched to Sony because I enjoyed the experience better on that Sony camera than I did on Canon, and I was willing to make some other sacrifices. That's where I've been at in the last 6 months with this Nikon Z6. I've been willing to make some sacrifices because this camera isn't perfect, and I'll talk briefly about that. But I've been making some sacrifices basically with lens options because this camera has just been easier for me to use. It's been faster. It's my grab and go camera, and I still get that full frame. I still get a great image out of my camera. It's not grab a point and shoot because that's, something that's easier than our DSLR or our bigger camera. This camera has just been really easy and convenient for me. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about the features of the camera and what I've really appreciated about it. I did finally put together a settings video for this camera. I initially didn't make many changes to the settings because I wanted to experience the camera the way it came configured, but there were some things that I needed to change just because of my shooting style and my workflow, and so I put a video out for that. You'll definitely want to check that out. But the ergonomics, I think, have been one of the biggest ones. This camera is just really well balanced. It doesn't matter what lens I put on this camera. I have a lot of the prime lenses, and I also have this bigger 24-70, and the camera feels really well balanced. Now, we don't have a 70-200 for this camera yet that would be maybe a bigger lens. That is a definite shortfall right now. You'd have to go and get a older, like DSLR lens and then adapt it to this camera to get beyond, really, I guess, beyond 70 millimeters. I don't think there's much that's further beyond 70 millimeters. There's an 85 millimeter, but you can't get beyond 100 millimeters with this camera right now, which is kind of a frustration. Like I said, the sacrifices, and if you have access to everything and you end up grabbing one, I mean, that kind of speaks for itself. So the ergonomics, the balance, the weight of the camera, it's not bad. It's not bad in comparison to the other cameras. It's not as heavy as a DSLR, but it's not as light as some of the smaller Sonys with smaller lenses. So it feels good. It feels well balanced. The button placement, I think, has also been something that I've gotten used to really, really quickly. With mirrorless cameras, we don't necessarily need all the buttons that you would have on a DSLR camera because we have that electric viewfinder, the EVF here, and I'm often looking through the EVF and even reviewing my images in the EVF, especially when I'm shooting photos of people, whether it be portraits or a wedding or something like that. I'm looking through the EVF because I don't want people to think, maybe be thinking, oh, the image isn't that good, or what's he thinking about the image when I'm looking down at the camera and spending all my time looking down at the camera. And I'm looking for things that are wrong, and they can see on my face that I'm looking for things that are wrong. And so looking through the EVF, they might even just think I'm framing up my next shot or maybe making a change to my settings. They don't know that I'm looking at the actual images. And so when we're not looking down at our camera like this, holding it this way, we don't need buttons over on the left-hand side of the screen. But the buttons that are placed over here on the right side of the screen and up towards the top of the camera are very well placed. At first, I did not like the position of the ISO button and the fact that you had to hold it down and rotate something to adjust the ISO, but I absolutely love it now because I don't have to crank my thumb to the bottom of the camera to make adjustments to ISO like I do on most other cameras. Of course, on a lot of Canons, you have to press the ISO button down and then rotate something. I usually configure my camera so the dial on the back can be rotated to adjust the ISO, but you do have to kind of crank your thumb down in order, you're like moving your hand down to get access to that. On this camera, you don't have to move your hand from this position for anything really. You've got your ability to switch between photo and video mode here. You have the ability to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture right here. You have your ISO button here, and you just simply press down the ISO button and rotate one of the dials, and it's going to adjust the ISO for you. So it's really nice. You also even have your video shooting button right here, so that when you are in video mode, you can do that. All the buttons are just easily accessible. When the only time that I'm really pulling my camera down is if I do want to tap to focus and move my focus point around on the back of the camera, because as I talk about in my settings video, I don't utilize the full screen, the full sensor for autofocus. I use selected point autofocus, and I talk about that in that video. I won't waste your time right now with that. But if you're interested in why I don't let the camera just do whatever it wants for autofocus, you'll want to check out that video. So with that said, the ergonomics, the weight balance of the camera, the button placement is great. The two function buttons down here by the lens on the front of the camera body itself are amazing. They were a little weird to me at first because I wasn't used to having anything down there. But now with these buttons there, I can't not use them. They're fantastic having them there. Easily being able to go and change my focus mode and easily being able to go and make other changes just are great. And you'll have to watch my settings video to see exactly what I'm using those buttons for. But my gosh, I love having them there. Now, the lenses are also starting to get some additional stuff, which is great. The lenses are really good. I like the fact that this camera has a third ring. It's not very customizable yet. I wish I can adjust the ISO with this third ring. Right now, you can only, I think, adjust the aperture, and I think there's one other thing that you can adjust, but it's better than nothing. Overall, image quality and video quality out of this camera have been great. Pretty much any photos that you see, if you go look at my State of Tech channel, these would be photos that would be in my videos or even on the social media. And a lot of the images that are on the social media for Ditch Auto are taken with this camera. Of course, unless this camera is the one that's being pictured, then I took it with something else. But because this camera is just so easy and grab and go, it's been just my go-to for that. So the photo quality is absolutely fantastic. Now, I am still not really so patiently anymore waiting for the 4K RAW output of this camera so that it can go 4K RAW out of the camera into something like an Atomos digital recorder, because sometimes I do shoot real estate photos and real estate video, and I sure would love to have RAW shooting in that scenario so that I can do some post-production work to the video that would more match the HDR images that I'm exporting out of the camera for the photo portion. And so I am waiting for that still, and that would be something that would definitely change my opinion even more about this camera right now. Unfortunately, that still is not something that is available. But the updates have been coming pretty quickly with this camera. There's firmware updates coming almost every month, maybe every month and a half. There's firmware updates for this camera, and so they've been adding stuff to it and making the experience improved over time, which I think is great. I do have an opportunity soon to utilize the Z7, and so I'll be back to talk about my opinions with the Z7. I think that this camera would be a great option for anybody that is deciding to switch from a DSLR platform right now, especially if you are on Nikon already. This would be the clear choice to upgrade to. But if you are shooting on a different platform and you're thinking about switching, if I was thinking about switching from Sony because I didn't have so much money invested in Sony stuff, I would definitely be considering making this my primary. The main reason that I have not is because I do shoot a lot of low light, and Sony still really has the they take the cake with low light, and then also they have fast lenses as well, whereas Nikon does not have fast lenses yet that are native to this camera mount. And so with that, I kind of have to stick to my Sonys for right now. But like I said at the beginning of this video, this Nikon is giving me the feelings that I had when I first switched to Sony, and was the reason that I switched to Sony, was the usability of the camera, the overall feel and the experience. It's not a perfect camera. I mean, you know, these days we kind of expect a little bit more out of our display. This display does not go far. It does not rotate that well, but it is a nice display. Yes, I do wish it got a little brighter. Yes, I do wish the battery life on the camera was a little better. It is pretty good, but it's not as good as the latest Sony camera optimizations in their with their cameras and their batteries. So, is that a deal breaker? No, because the battery for this particular camera is fairly common and they're easy to get and the price isn't too bad on them. So you just buy a couple more batteries, and then also USB-C charging right in the side of the camera. Plug it in, top it off at any time. My camera is always ready to go with a full battery because it's that easy to do. So this camera, I believe, is priced really well. The lenses still are, they're priced okay because they're midline lenses. They're not top of the line like a G Master or an L series with Canon, or the higher end lenses for Nikon. Yeah, but they're also not the lowest end lenses as well. They're a good middle of the ground lens that perform really well for the price. So with that said, I don't want to talk too much longer about this camera. I do absolutely love it. It's been a blessing to have and use, and I think that it's a great option for anybody that is deciding to either switch platforms or maybe go from DSLR to mirrorless. So if you have any questions, definitely ask them down in the comment section below. I'll do my best to answer them. I'll be back talking more about this camera as I talk more about the different lenses and lens options that are available for it. And then of course I'll be back with the Z7 content as well as soon as I have some time to spend with that camera. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for watching my 6 months of experience and kind of opinion about this camera. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you do, give it a thumbs up, and I hope to see you back here soon in another video. Take care.